The oil lamp on the wooden wall of the bridal
Watch the moon
chamber
tonight.
flickered once and then
Some
went out.
secrets only reveal
Chaik stood
themselves
at the
in
half-open
darkness,
doorway
no
with his
matter where
heart
you
climbing
feel
up
till
into his
sunrise.
throat, because it
What
was
was
his
that?
wedding night, and he was about to lay his eyes on the woman he had spent 7 years of his life to claim. Inside the chamber, Adiz sat on the white cotton sheet with her back to him, her braids falling down her shoulders like the slow current of the river Niger in moonlight. He crossed the small room in 3 quick steps, and when he laid his palm upon her naked shoulder, her skin felt cold.
But
Not
no
the
one is
cold of a
ever
woman
breeze
whose
cursed
skin
by
is
an
cool from a
ancient
long
guardian
bath,
spirit.
not the cold of a woman whose skin is cool from the night air. The cold he felt under his palm was the cold of something that had never been a woman at all. It was the cold of a river stone lying alone at the bottom of a deep stream for many long years. It was the cold of a creature that had been wearing the costume of a human bride for exactly long enough to walk through a wedding gate,
I married
eat
you.
jollof rice, dance
Not
under a
your
mango
curse.
tree, and slip into a bridal chamber with the man whose bride price the gods had quietly set as bait. He whispered her name. She did not turn around. He whispered her name a second time, and the sound that came back to him from her mouth was not a woman voice at all. It was a long hiss, the kind of hiss that fills a forest at the hour when the python stretches itself across the path of the man who has come home too late from the farm. He lifted the dripping lamp to her face, and what he saw made his soul climb out of his body and hide behind his ribs. Adiz's face was no longer a face. Her skin was splitting open from the crown of her head down to the small of her back, and beneath the soft brown skin was the long pale body of a python, dripping wet river water from its scales onto the white cotton sheet. Her eyes had turned the color of dirty honey. Her tongue had split into 2 thin arrows that flickered in and out of her mouth, the small green snakes on the village stream flick their tongues at the children who come to fill water in the dry season. The woman he had loved for 7 years was not a woman at all. She had eaten from his plate. She had slept on his mat. She had let his mother call her daughter. She had let the village women praise her beauty at the wedding dance. She had shed her skin for him at last, on the wedding night, exactly as the river priestess of Arachukwu had warned him it would happen if the bride price had been raised from a pure heart. Chaik ran out of the chamber barefoot, with the village drums still beating their wedding beat in the compound outside, and he did not stop running until his feet met the cold water of the stream at the edge of the village, where the elder women wash cassava in the early mornings before the sun comes up. If this story touched your heart, kindly subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next folktale, and stay with me because none of what happened at that wedding had been what the groom had prepared for, and the village had even less of an idea than the groom himself. Stay with me, my dear ones, because what the village did not want to remember about that wedding morning is something this folktale refuses to forget. The morning of the wedding, Chaik woke before the cock crowed, and he walked to the stream at the edge of the village to wash his face in the running water, the way a man washes his face on the morning that his life is about to change. As he knelt at the water, an old woman walked past him on the bank. She was a woman he had never seen in the village before, and her wrapper was the color of dry banana leaves, and her voice was the gravel voice of a woman who has outlived 3 husbands and 4 children. She looked down at him and told him that the bride he was about to marry was not the woman her father and mother had raised. She told him that the bride had been set for him by the river goddess, and that the river goddess had a price to pay for the man who had paid the bride price without first pouring palm wine on the ground of her shrine. She told him that on the night of the wedding, the bride would shed her skin, and the man who would not be ready would be swallowed. She said no more, and then she walked away into the bush, and Chaik knelt at the stream and did not know what to do with the warning, because the bride price had been paid in full the night before, and the drums were already on their way to the compound to begin the wedding morning. Chaik walked back to his father compound with the warning tucked inside the corner of his wrapper, and when his aunt Mama Ifoma asked him where he had been, he told her only that he had been to the stream, and he said nothing of the old woman. The morning moved on. The drummer arrived. The women began to sing. The bride arrived at the gate in her white wrapper and her coral beads, and she was so beautiful that every man in the village square forgot the kind of beauty that hides a curse, and Chaik forgot it too. Tap that subscribe button before you leave, because this story has many bends in the road, and the bends are exactly the parts that make the village elders keep telling it at every fire at night. Long before that wedding night, Chaik was a small boy with no shoes and a hungry belly, the first son of a yam farmer who worked a stretch of land near Owerri that did not even belong to him. His mother had died bringing him into the world, and so he was raised by his father Mazi Okafor and his father's younger sister Mama Ifoma, who had walked into their compound one morning with her bundle on her head and her heart on her sleeve, and who had sworn to her brother that she would treat her nephew as her own firstborn child. Mama Ifoma was not a kind woman by nature, but she was a fair woman by promise, and she kept the promise she had made to her brother for as long as Chike stayed in the compound. She fed him the pounded yam and egusi soup that other children in the village only smelled from afar. She dressed him in the patched agbada of her late husband. She sent him to the village school where the catechist taught English with a heavy whip. She did all of this without ever saying the words of affection to the boy, because the Igbo proverb says that love that is announced is love that is not yet proven. She proved her love with food. She proved her love with school fees. She proved her love with the cheap sandals she bought him every December before the Yuletide festival. Chike grew up in that compound believing that life was simple, that kindness was given in silence, and that if he worked hard enough, the gods would bless him with the kind of wife every farmer boy dreams of on the long road home from his father farm. He worked his father farm every morning from sunrise to noon, and he worked the Onitsha motor park every afternoon until his shoulders burned, and he walked home in the dark of the night with the small coins tied in the corner of his wrapper. By the time he was 19, he had the frame of a man and the patience of a man twice his age, and by the time he was 23, he had saved enough to begin the long road to the bride, price his father had asked for. He did not know that the bride waiting for him at the end of that road had been promised to the river before she was even breathing. Share this story with one friend who needs it today, because the warning the old woman gave him at the stream was the warning his own village would not let him speak about the morning after the wedding night. When Chike turned 19, his father called him to the small parlour of their compound one evening and spread out a length of white cloth on the floor between them. Mazi Okafor sat on the only chair in the house and looked at his son with the careful eyes of a man who has been counting the days. He told Chike that he had seen a girl 3 villages away, in a town near Onitsha, and the girl was the most beautiful maiden he had ever laid eyes on. Her name was Adiz, the daughter of a fisherman who had grown wealthy from the rivers, and her dowry was heavy. She required 10,000 naira in bride price, 3 full bags of rice, 2 live goats, and 100 yards of George wrapper. The price was meant to discourage the lazy and the beggars of the village. Only the most hard-working of men would ever think of paying it. Chike looked at the white cloth on the floor and saw his father's future written on it. He accepted the challenge with a small bow of his head, the way a son bows before his father in Igbo land, and he walked out of the parlour that night with a new name written on the inside of his chest, the name of a man with a purpose. From that night on, he woke before the cock crowed. He worked his father farm from sunrise to noon. He walked 9 miles to the Onitsha motor park and loaded yams into lorries until his shoulders burned, and he walked back home in the dark of the night with the small coins tied in the corner of his wrapper. His friend Obana, a thin carpenter who shared a room with him at the village square, watched all of this with quiet admiration, and sometimes warned Chike that he was working himself into the grave. Obana never told his friend the strange dream he had begun to have about a woman with yellow eyes standing at the edge of a stream. Obana was not a man who trusted his own dreams. Stay with me, because what Chike did not know was that the woman he was saving for was being kept for him by the river goddess herself, and the goddess had plans of her own that no human bride price could buy off. 7 years of this kind of work stripped Chike down to the bone. His palms hardened like the bark of an iroko tree. His laugh grew thin because laughter cost breath, and breath was something he could not afford to waste. He learned to turn down roasted yam at the roadside, even when his mouth wait. Read at the smoky smell of the suya man. He learned to walk past the pepper soup joint at the bend of the road without stopping at the door, even when Obana teased him that his stomach was about to march into the bowl on its own. He learned to wear the same faded shirt to church every Sunday, and to ask the catechist for a smaller hymn book he could borrow without paying the deposit. Adiz heard all of these things from her father women friends, who would visit her mother compound with baskets of bitter leaf on their heads and small stories on their tongues. She heard that the young farmer from the next village had set his eyes on her and was paying for her in patient coins. She smiled a quiet smile to herself in the cool dark of her thatch room. She did not know yet in those early days what she truly was.
What was that?
She had not yet been called by the river. She was still a young maiden, soft around the edges, dreaming of marriage like other girls her age. The river had not yet sent her the dream that would change her life. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story is breaking your heart the most, because we are only at the second bend of a long, long road.
I want
The
to
day
tell
Adiz
you,
called Chike to her father
but no one has
compound for
ever
the first
believed
time.
cursed by an
The
ancient
air was
guardian
heavy with the
spirit.
smell of rain that had not yet fallen. She stood at the gate with her hands folded across her chest, and she looked at the young farmer in his patched shirt with eyes that held a sadness he could not place. She told him, with a voice that trembled like the surface of the river in early morning, that she was very glad he had come. She told him that she knew what he had given up to come to her. She told him that she had been praying that the man her father chose for her would be a man of soil and patience, and now that she had seen him, she knew her prayers had been answered. Chaik listened to her speak, and felt his chest tighten with the kind of joy that only a poor man who is about to be loved by a beautiful woman can understand. He knelt in front of her, the way a man kneels when he is asking for something he cannot afford to lose, and he slipped a small copper ring onto her finger that he had bought from the roadside jeweler with the last of his savings that season. She kept the ring on her finger from that day onward. She did not take it off at night. She did not take it off when she went to the stream. She did not take it off even when the river began to whisper things to her in the dark hours before dawn, things she did not want to hear. Little did Chaik know that the woman kneeling beside him at her farther gate was not entirely hers to give, because the river goddess had begun to look at her with the eye of a woman laying claim to a long-lost daughter. Stay with me because the wedding day is closer than you think, and the food the village will eat at that wedding will be the talk of 3 villages for years to come. The wedding day arrived like the first thunder of Harmattan. Mama Ifoma borrowed 3 full wrappers from her wealthier neighbours in Aba, and she cooked jollof rice in 3 iron pots large enough to feed a whole extended family. She prepared pounded yam with egusi soup, so thick a wooden spoon could stand in it without tipping over. She prepared pepper soup with the dried fish her brother had kept in the barn from the previous harvest. She prepared akara and muamua and fried plantain, and she set out the kola nuts and the alligator pepper on the small wooden tray, the way her own mother had done for her own wedding many years before. The village square was decorated with palm fronds and white cloth. The talking drums arrived at noon. The women sang in the Igbo way, with their voices climbing and falling like the call of the oriole at sunset. The men gathered under the large mango tree with their walking sticks and their prayers for the young couple. Chaik wore the new agbada his father had bought with the last of his savings from the previous yam harvest, and the agbada was the colour of ripe mango leaves, and the cap matched, and the shoes were the simple brown shoes his aunt had polished for 2 full hours the night before. He stood at the threshold of his father's compound waiting for his bride to arrive, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has finally arrived at a place he was not sure he would ever reach. Drop a comment underneath telling me which part of this story is breaking your heart the most, because we are still at the 3rd bend, and the river is getting ready to collect what has always belonged to the river. Adiz arrived at the head of a small procession of bridesmaids in coral wrappers and white beads, and every man in the village square stopped breathing at the same time. She was the most beautiful woman Chaik had ever seen in his entire life. She wore a long flowing gown of pure white, with a head tie that sat on her brow like a crown. She carried a small bouquet of fresh flowers she had cut from her mother's garden. At sunrise, she walked with the slow, graceful stride of a goddess walking on water. Her eyes were as dark as the nights over the village when the moon was hidden behind the clouds. Her skin was the colour of fresh honey poured on warm bread. Her smile was the soft smile of a woman who finally understood that the long road her suitor had walked to reach her was a road worth honouring. Their fathers exchanged the bride price that day. The kola nuts were broken. The alligator pepper was shared. The prayers were spoken over the couple. The jollof rice was served in small bowls to the elders first. The pounded yam was served with the egusi soup, and the women filled their plates with the kind of laughter that only happens when there is enough food for everyone at the wedding. The drums beat until the sun went down. The bride and the groom sat on the small wooden throne in the center of the village square and received the prayers of their elders one by one, and every prayer they received was a prayer the village had not prayed for a young couple in a long, long time. The bride smiled through every prayer, but somewhere deep behind her eyes, behind the smile and the white gown and the coral beads, something the bride could not explain was beginning to stir. Her hands began to feel too cool for the noon sun. Her shoulders began to move in the small rippling motion that the python makes when it is folding itself back into the river at sunrise. Stay with me, because the bride face did something at sunset that none of the bridesmaids understood, and Obina saw it, and Obina did not say a word. By nightfall the bride and groom had eaten the last plate of jollof rice, and the last calabash of palm wine had been emptied, and the drums had stopped their singing, and the village square had settled into the deep warm hush of a wedding night. Chaik and Adiz walked away from the square towards the small bridal chamber his aunt had prepared at the edge of the compound. Adiz held on to Chaik's arm with the soft grip of a woman who was finally going home. Her head rested lightly on his shoulder. The voices of their well-wishers called after them in the Igbo way, telling them to go gently and to come back as father and mother in the morning. The small lamp on the wall of the bridal chamber had been trimmed by Mama Ifoma before she left for her own room. The white sheet on the bed had been smoothed with the back of her hand 3 times that afternoon. 2 cooked yams had been set beside a small bowl of red oil and a small pot of egusi soup on the wooden stool by the door, so the bride and groom would not have to leave the chamber that night. Everything had been done according to custom. Everything had been done with love. The lamp went out. The chamber went dark. The bride sat on the bed with her back to Chaik. And what Chaik saw when he lifted the lamp to her face was not the bride he had brought home from the village gate that afternoon. It was the creature the river had been building her toward for the 7 years he had loved her. If this story touched your heart tonight, kindly subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next folktale. The lamp went out. The skin began to crack. The river began to collect what had always belonged to the river. The next dawn, Chaik sat on a fallen log at the edge of the stream with the cold water lapping at his feet, and his body was trembling in the kind of way a man body trembles when his soul has just been turned inside out by something his eyes cannot unsee. Obina found him there at sunrise, with his agbada torn and his agbada cap missing and his shoes lying half in the water. Obina sat beside him without asking a single question, because a man who finds his friend weeping silently at the edge of a stream at dawn is a man who understands that the questions will only come when the friend is ready to give them. They sat together for 1 full hour without a word. Then Chaik opened his mouth, and the story of the bridal chamber came out of him in small broken sentences, the way rice pours out of a torn bag at the market. He told Obina that Adiz had shed her skin. He told Obina that what lay beneath the skin was a river python. He told Obina that she had hissed at him with a voice the size of a whole forest. He told Obina that she had tried to wrap her coils around his leg as he fled the chamber, and that only the speed of his fear had saved his life. Obina listened carefully, and when Chaik was done, Obina said softly that he had dreamed this dream 3 nights in a row before the wedding, and that he had kept the dream to himself because a man who warns his friend of a bad dream is labelled a madman in his own village. Chaik looked at Obina with the hollow eyes of a man who has just learned that the women who praise his bride in the village square were praising a being who had come to destroy him. Stay with me, because what the village did to Chaik the very next day as a kind of cruelty that not even the oracles of Arachakwu had ever seen before. When Chaik walked back into the village at midday, he expected his father to embrace him and his aunt to cry over him. He expected the village to gather and to pray over him and to chase away the spirit that had come to his bridal chamber. What happened was the opposite. Mama Ifoma stood at the gate of her compound with her wrapper tied tightly at her waist and her face set like a stone that has been carved for a chief burial. She refused to let Chaik enter the compound. She told him, in front of the neighbours who had gathered to hear her voice, that a man who runs out of his bridal chamber on the first night is a man who is not a man. She told him that Adiz was a good wife who had done nothing wrong, and that his own madness was the madness of a man who has eaten too much jollof rice and has gotten lost in a dream. She told him that if he tried to enter the compound again, she would call the village elders to sit on him and tie him with ropes. His father Mazi Okafa came out of the parlour behind her, and instead of defending his son, he lowered his head in the way a man lowers his head when his wife has already spoken for the family. He told Chaik, with a small voice that cracked at the edges, that he had paid too much bride price for the bride to be sent back, and that whatever Chaik saw on the wedding night was Chaik's own mind playing tricks on him. The village women who had just praised Adiz the day before now whispered behind their wrappers that Chaik was a madman, that Chaik had been bewitched by jealous relatives, that Chaik had never been strong enough to marry a beautiful woman in the first place. The men in the village square looked at Chaik from a distance, the way men look at a man whose shadow is no longer trustworthy. None of them asked him what he had seen. None of them wanted to know. Adiz's father sent a delegation to demand the return of the bride price, the rice bags, the goats and the George wrapper, and Chaik was forced to sign a paper that admitted he had wronged a virtuous woman by running from her on the night of her wedding. The paper was witnessed by 7 village elders. The paper was stamped with the village red seal. The paper was kept in the family shrine so that future generations of the village would know that Chaik had rejected a perfect wife without good reason. Stay here, because what Chaik did with that night of public humiliation was something the village would never forgive, and what came after was something the village had not planned for at all. Chaik did not defend himself in the village square. He did not gather the elders of his own family. He did not carry the small ring he had given Adiz on the day they first met to the village shrine as proof that his bride had been sent by the river. He took the
I
small
never
bundle he had
wanted to
prepared
hurt
for a
you.
different kind of life, the bundle
I
he had
married
kept
you,
beside his father's farmland in
not your
case the
curse.
rains failed, and he walked out of the village on the red earth road without turning his back to look at the compound even once. He walked until he reached the Onitsha Motor Park, and from there he boarded a lorry to Lagos, where his elder cousin lived in a one-room apartment on the island and sold second-hand clothing to the market women of Balagun. The lorry was full of traders and their bundles. The seat beside him was taken by a young woman carrying a basket of smoked fish on her lap. Chaik did not speak to the woman. He did not speak to anyone. He sat on the lorry with his face turned toward the window, and the red earth road of the village became the tarred road of Lagos, and as the tarred road passed under the wheels, Chaik felt the last piece of his old life quietly leave his chest. When he stepped out of the lorry at Ojota, the city was loud and the air was thick, and the smell of exhaust mixed with the smell of pepper soup coming from the woman frying by the road, and Chaik knew in his stomach that this was the place his new life had to begin. He did not have a trade that would earn him much. He did not have friends in the city. He did not have a place to sleep for the night. The only thing he had was the small bundle in his hand, and the memory of a friend who had warned him about the dream he had refused to hear. He walked into the heart of the city, the way a man walks into a river he does not know the depth of, with one foot testing the weight of the water before the next. Stay with me, because what Chaik did not know about the woman selling akara at the corner of the road was about to change the rest of his life in a way no prophet in his village had ever predicted. In Lagos, Chaik slept on the floor of his cousin's one-room apartment for the first week. He watched his cousin go out at dawn to the market and come back at nightfall with coins that were never enough to cover the rent and the food and the diesel for the small generator. On the 8th morning, Chaik woke up before his cousin, and he walked into the streets of Lagos with the last of his small change in his pocket and a small wooden tray he had borrowed from a neighbor at the compound where his cousin lived. He bought a small bag of beans from a woman at Mile 12 Market, and he walked to the corner of a busy road where market women passed on their way to work, and he set up a small akara stand. He had learned to fry akara from his mother before she died, and the smell of his akara rose up from the hot oil like a prayer to the morning. The first woman stopped. She tasted one ball. She came back the next day with 3 of her friends. By the second week, Chaik had built a small circle of customers, all of them market women, all of them willing to wait the 15 minutes it took for him to drop each batch into the oil. By the second month, he had saved enough to rent a small wooden shed at the same corner, and he had added moi and fried plantain to his menu. By the third month, his akara was the talk of 3 streets, and the Okada riders who passed the corner every morning stopped twice a week to buy breakfast before their first trip. His cousin, who had watched him with careful eyes from the start, told him that he was a man who could turn pepper into soup if he had been given a chance, and that the village had been wrong to send him away. Share this story with one friend who needs it today, because what the village did to Chaik was a wound that the city was slowly beginning to heal, and the healing had a name, and the name was Ngozi. The woman who saved Chaik from the dark long nights of his first weeks in Lagos was a quiet nurse named Ngozi, who passed his stand every morning on her way to the small clinic where she worked at Yaba. She was the daughter of a catechist from Aba who had moved to Lagos after her father died, and she had been raised in the same kind of simple faith that Mama Ifoma had tried to teach Chaik when he was a boy. She tasted his akara one morning because a customer in front of her had bought the last ball from the previous batch and was taking too long to gather her change. She tasted it, and she told him in a voice that did not pretend that the akara was the best she had tasted since her mother own. She came back the next morning at the same time. She came back the third morning. She came back the fourth morning, and by the fifth morning Chaik understood that the woman was not coming for the akara but was coming for the man behind the stand. They spoke slowly, the way slow things begin. She told him the small story of where she was from. He told her the small story of where he was from. She told him she had lost her father the year before. He told her he had lost his mother when he was a boy. They walked together along the waterfront at Marina on the few evenings when Chaik could close the stand before sunset. They bought fried plantain from a small buka near the bridge and ate it together standing up, because they did not yet have a chair they could call their own. She never once asked him about the village. She never once pressed him about the bride he had left behind. She only asked him about his hopes and his small plans, and she listened to him as though every answer he gave was a small prayer she was collecting for her own future. Tap that subscribe button before you leave, because what came into Ngozi's body 3 months after the small wedding would change the meaning of every coin Chaik had ever earned at the Akara stand. When Chaik finally proposed to her on a quiet evening beside the lagoon at dusk, he knelt on the wet sand the way his father had knelt in front of his mother many years before, and he offered her the small copper ring he had never thrown away, the same ring he had once placed on Adi's finger. Ngozi took the ring with a small smile and told him that the ring was enough for her. She did not ask about its history. The ring had been cleansed by 2 years of wear in his pocket. The ring was ready for a new hand. Their wedding in Lagos was a small affair with no drums and no village square and no jollof rice in 3 iron pots. But it had pounded yam with egusi soup, and it had pepper soup, and the small chapel at the back of the cathedral was full of nurses and market women who had known the couple through the Akara stand and the small clinic and the long quiet Sundays by the roadside. Ngozi wore a simple white dress she had sewn at the kitchen table of the flat she shared with 2 other nurses, and Chaik wore a clean agbada his cousin had bought from the second-hand stall at Balagun. The priest who performed the small ceremony had been the catechist of Ngozi parish in Aba, and he had come to Lagos only the week before for a conference, and the small wedding had been the first quiet miracle the priest had performed in the new city. The priest placed his hand on their heads and prayed the prayer of marriage, and the prayer that came out the priest's mouth was the prayer of a man who could see the hand of God moving quietly in the lives of 2 quiet people. After the wedding, Chaik walked back to the Akara stand with Ngozi on his arm, and the customers who had come for Akara that morning saw the bride, and one of the old women customers began to weep because the bride looked like her own daughter who had passed away in a childbirth the year before. 3 months after the wedding, Ngozi began to feel the kind of tiredness that small clinic nurses feel when the body is preparing for a change. She would close her eyes at the stand after a long shift and fall asleep in 2 minutes flat, with her head resting on her folded wrapper. Chaik watched her from the stand and felt his heart soften in the kind of way that a husband's heart softens when the body of the woman he loves begins to change from one purpose to another. By the 4th month, the tiredness had a name, and Ngozi went to the small clinic where she worked and asked her senior nurse to examine her. The senior nurse laid her palm gently on Ngozi's stomach, and after a long pause, she smiled the smile of a senior nurse who has been called by God to deliver good news. She told Ngozi that her stomach was carrying the gift of more than one child. She told her that the sound she had heard through her stethoscope was not 1 heartbeat but 2, and possibly 3. Ngozi sat in the small clinic and did not speak for 5 full minutes, because the woman who had prayed quietly for years at the foot of her father's grave had just received the answer to every prayer her father had prayed for her before he died. When she went home that evening, she held Chaik's face in both hands and told him the news. Chaik's eyes filled with the kind of tears that do not fall but only rise, the way the river rises when the rains have come home at last. He held her close, and they stood together in the small wooden shed that had been their kitchen and their bedroom and their chapel all at once, and Chaik whispered to Ngozi that the village had called him cursed, and that the curse had just been answered by a different god. If this story touched your heart tonight, kindly subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next folktale, and tell me in the comments whether the miracle of the triplets is the miracle you needed to hear today. The triplets came 6 months later, in the early hours of a Sunday morning at the small clinic in Yaba, and the senior nurse delivered them one by one with calm hands, and every nurse on duty that morning stopped her own work to come and look at the 3 small miracles wrapped in white cotton on the small clinic bed. The 3 babies cried together for the first time, and Ngozi wept against the clinic wall, in a kind of joy that her father in heaven must have seen and smiled at. Chaik stood at the foot of the bed with his hands trembling and his agbada cap in his hands, and he whispered the prayer his mother had taught him before she died, the prayer that begins with the Igbo praise of Chukwu, the Almighty. Share this story with one friend who needs it today, because the triplets Chaik had been told he could never have were now crying in a small clinic in Lagos, and the village that had shamed him did not know. The miracle did not end with the triplets. A few weeks after the births, a letter arrived at the Akara stand from a lawyer in Port Harcourt whose name Chaik had never seen before. The letter was stamped with the seal of a high court. The letter told Chaik that a distant relative of his late mother, a wealthy trader who had made his fortune in cocoa and palm oil and who had no children of his own, had passed away 3 months earlier in a small town near Aba and had left a will that named Chaik as the only heir to a small estate, and a sum of money that would fix the kind of life Chaik had been quietly living on the corner of the road. The letter explained that the trader had been searching for any child of his late sister for over 20 years, and a village elder who had known Chaik's mother in her girlhood had finally pointed him towards the village near Owerri, and from the village the trail had led him to the Akara stand in Lagos. The money was enough. The estate was enough. The miracle of the triplets and the miracle of the inheritance had both arrived in the same season, the way the rains and the harvest sometimes arrive together in the month of the yams. Chaik sat in the small clinic that evening after the babies had been laid to sleep in their small cot, and he prayed the prayer his father had taught him as a child, the prayer that begins with Our Father who art in heaven, and he ended the prayer with the words of his mother, the words he had only heard his aunt speak at her grave once a year, which were these: "The Lord saw me before the village did, and the Lord has remembered me after the village forgot. Stay with me, because the invitation that came the morning after the inheritance letter was an invitation the village had been planning for 3 seasons of the Harmattan, and the village had no idea what was about to walk down the red earth road in answer to the invitation. The festival of the river goddess arrived in the village near Onitsha in the dry season, when the Harmattan had stripped the leaves off the Iroko tree, and the dust of the red earth rose up to greet the feet of the visitors. It was the celebration that every man in the village looked forward to every 3 years, the celebration that brought traders from Aba and Onitsha and Port Harcourt and even Lagos into the village square for 3 full days of drumming and feasting. This year, the elders of the village had decided to make the festival larger than the festival before it. They had decided to crown a new chief of the river goddess as well. They had invited the wealthy fishermen who worked the river for miles around. They had invited the traders who had grown rich from the river. They had also invited, with the cruel kindliness of village gossip, every family in the surrounding villages, including the family of the farmer who had run from his wedding night. Mama Ifoma told Chaik about the invitation when he called her on a Saturday morning from Lagos. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had not expected him to ever call her again, and her voice was also the voice of a woman who had been carrying her own quiet guilt for the years since Chaik had walked out of the village. She told Chaik that she had heard he was doing well. She told him that the village had been talking about him. She told him, with the careful honesty of an old woman, that Adiz had been married again to a fisherman from the river, and that the fisherman had died inside of 1 year of an illness nobody could name, and that Adiz had been left alone again in her father compound with her reputation slowly turning to dust. She told him that the village elders had voted to invite him to the festival, not out of kindness, but out of the strange cruelty village gossip sometimes hides under the wrapper of kindness. She told him that his absence from the festival would be the talk of the village for years to come. She told him that his presence at the festival would be the talk of the village for years to come. Tap that subscribe button before you leave, because the decision Chaik was about to make about this invitation was the decision that would change the festival forever, and the woman sitting beside him in the small wooden shed had already begun to choose the wrapper she would wear to the festival of the river goddess. Chaik did not refuse the invitation. He called Ngozi into the small wooden shed that evening and laid the letter on the wooden table between them. He told her calmly that the village had invited him back for the festival of the river goddess, and that his aunt had told him about Adiz's sadness after the death of her husband. He told Ngozi, with the slow honesty of a man who has no secrets from his wife, that the woman he had married first had been a snake woman in human form, and that the news of his bride's sad second marriage had opened a wound in his chest he had thought had been closed forever. Ngozi listened to him speak, and she did not interrupt.
I married you.
And when he was done, she asked him one small question in a voice that was steady as the river in the dry season. She asked him if he still loved the woman who had shed her skin in front of him. Chaik told her no. He told her the woman he had loved had been a river goddess in disguise, and that the woman he had been praying for since his boyhood had been Ngozi from the Akara stand. He asked Ngozi if she would go with him to the village. She told him that she would go, and that the triplets would go, and that the new car he had bought with the inheritance money would take them there, and that the village would see what the village had thrown away in the morning of its cruelty. Stay with me, because what the village saw next broke something inside the elder chest that could not be mended for years. The morning of the second day of the festival, the sun rose over the red earth of the village, in the way the sun rises over the river goddess water, slow and heavy and full of heat. The village square was already filled with traders and farmers and fishermen and their wives, and the elders were arranging the new chief throne under the Iroko tree, where the drummers were tuning their drums for the morning chanting. The talking drum began its slow first voice at sunrise. The smell of jollof rice and pepper soup and pounded yam and egusi rose from the iron pots the women had set up at the back of the square. The village women wore their best wrappers and their coral beads and their head ties. The men wore their best agbada and their caps and their polished shoes. The mood of the village was the mood of a people celebrating the river that gave them fish and water and yams and life. The eldest chief, Mazi Okafor own father, who had walked out of his small hut at dawn to take his seat at the throne, lifted his chin to greet the early visitors. And he did not yet know that the visitor coming down the red earth road in a brand new black car, with 3 small children in the back seat and a beautiful woman at his side, was his own grandson whom the village had chased away 7 years before. Share this story with one friend who needs it today, because what was about to happen at the festival would be retold at every fire in the village for years and years to come. The black car rolled to a stop at the small gate of the village square, and the sound the car made when it switched off its engine was louder to the village than the talking drum that had been playing all morning. The villagers turned their heads one by one, slowly, the way villagers turn their heads when a stranger arrives at a gathering, and what they saw was a scene they had not prepared their eyes for. Chaik stepped out of the driver's seat in a new white agbada the colour of fresh milk, with a new cap to match, and new shoes that shone like polished river stones in the morning sun. Ngozi stepped out of the passenger side in a coral wrapper and a white blouse, with a smile that did not perform but only rested on her face like a gift. And then Obana stepped out of the back seat on the other side, holding the hand of the eldest triplet, and behind him the nanny that Chaik had hired from the clinic stepped out carrying the 2 younger triplets, both dressed in matching white baby clothes that Ngozi had sewn with her own hands at the wooden table in the kitchen of their small flat in Lagos. The family of 4 stood together beside the black car, and the family did not need to say a word because the picture they were presenting was already saying everything. The elder chief looked at the car. The elder chief looked at the agbada. The elder chief looked at the triplets. The elder chief looked at the woman beside his grandson, and the elder chief looked at the nanny and the matching baby clothes. And the elder chief understood, with the slow understanding village elders sometimes have, that the grandson he had not defended 7 years ago was now standing in front of him as a man whose curse had been lifted by a different god. Tap that subscribe button before you leave, because the reaction of the village chief at the festival is the kind of moment that breaks the hearts of every elder who has ever cast out a quiet son in the morning of his anger. Mama Ifoma walked across the village square with her wrapper held high because she did not want anyone to see the tears streaming down her face. She did not speak when she arrived in front of her nephew. She simply opened her arms, and Chaik walked into her embrace the way a son walks into his mother embrace at the end of a long journey. She held him for a long moment. Then she turned her eyes to the triplets, and the sound she made when she saw the 3 small miracles was the small sound a woman makes when the prayer she has been praying for years has finally been answered in the flesh. She knelt down on the red earth of the village square in her best wrapper and took the eldest triplet from Obana's arms and held him against her chest, the way she had held her own son many years before, and the eldest triplet rested his small head against her shoulder as though he had known her all his life. The village women gathered around in a quiet circle that did not gossip. The village men lowered their eyes one by one, the way a man lowers his eyes when he is understanding something he should have understood years before. Chaik father Mazi Okafor stood at the door of the small parlour of the family compound, and he lowered his head in the same way he had lowered his head when Mama Ifoma had chased Chaik out of the gate 7 years before. But this time, the lowering of his head was not the lowering of a defeated man. It was the lowering of a man who has just realized what he lost when he did not defend his own son. He walked across the compound with slow, careful steps, and he placed his hand on his son's shoulder, and Chaik felt the weight of his father's hand the way a man feels the weight of a prayer that has finally been answered. Stay with me, because the second bride of the festival was about to arrive, and her arrival was the arrival the village had been preparing for 3 seasons of the Harmattan, and the smile on her face was the smile of a woman who had been rehearsing her triumph for years. Adiz arrived at the festival in the morning of the 2nd day, dressed in her most expensive wrapper, with the gold jewellery her dead husband had left for her hanging from her neck and her wrists. She arrived with the new man her father's family had chosen for her as her companion for the festival, a small-statured trader from the river who walked with the proud air of a man whose pockets were full, but whose heart was hollow. She entered the village square with the slow, deliberate steps of a woman who had been dreaming of this moment for 7 long years, and what she had been dreaming was the moment she would stand at the festival as the most respected bride among the village women. And what she had been dreaming was the moment she would walk past the compound of the farmer who had rejected her on their wedding night, and remind every gossip in the village that the farmer had been a fool. Drop a comment underneath telling me which moment of the festival broke your heart the most. Adiz stopped. Adiz did not speak. Adiz looked at Chaik, and Chaik looked back at Adiz, and the village held its breath the way the village holds its breath at the climax of a myth. The trader hand was still on her arm. The trader eyes followed her looking. The trader mouth fell slowly open. Adiz had not felt this kind of weight in her chest since the morning she had shed her skin and watched Chaik run barefoot into the dark of the bush outside the bridal chamber. She tried to smile the smile she had been rehearsing. The smile would not come. She tried to nod her head towards the triplets. The nod would not move. She tried to whisper some kind of greeting to the woman standing beside Chaik. The whisper died in her throat. The silence that filled the village square at that moment was a silence the drummers had never beaten, and the talk of the elders had never spoken, and the river goddess herself had not witnessed in the many centuries she had been watching the village. It was the silence of a woman whose mask had just been pulled off in public by a god she had not expected. If this story touched your heart tonight, kindly subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next folktale, and stay with me because what Adiz did next was something the village had not prepared for, and it was something the elders would argue about for many seasons of the Harmattan. Adiz did not run. Adiz did not speak. Adiz knelt down in the middle of the village square, with her gold jewelry still hanging on her neck and her coral wrapper still wrapped around her body, and she placed her forehead on the red earth of the village in the way a man kneels in front of the oracle at Arachukwu. The trader holding her arm fell back 2 steps in shock. Her father delegation behind her froze in their tracks. The elders at the throne under the Iroko tree lifted their chins in the way elders lift their chins when they are seeing something they do not fully understand. The villagers already in the square went silent in the way villagers go silent when the ground itself begins to speak. Adiz stayed on her knees with her forehead on the earth for a long moment, and then she lifted her head and spoke softly, in a voice that was not the voice of the proud bride she had been rehearsing to be. She spoke with the voice of a woman who had worn a mask for 7 years and was now asking permission to take it off in front of the people she had wronged. She said softly that she was sorry. She said softly that the wedding night was the night the river had finally collected her for the goddess, and that she had not been able to fight the river. She said softly that the fisherman she had married after Chaik had been taken by the river because she had not been faithful to the goddess. She said softly that Chaik had been the only man who had ever honored her as a woman, and that she had not honored him back, and that the children she had refused to give him were the curse the river had visited on her for refusing. The village heard her words. The village held its breath. The village had not known that the bride they had been praising had been a river goddess in disguise, and the village had not known that the curse of the fisherman had been the river judgment on a woman who had taken vows she could not keep. Stay with me, because what Chaik did at that moment was not the moment any elder of the village had predicted. Chaik did not stand over Adiz. He did not point a finger at her. He did not begin to tease her publicly, the way the gossip of the village had spread that he would do if she ever returned in shame. He did not bring up the names she had called him on the morning after the wedding night. He did not bring up the elders who had signed the paper that said he was mad. He walked across the village square with slow, even steps, and he knelt down beside Adiz on the red earth, in front of the elders and the traders and the fishermen and the village women and the drummers and his own father and his own aunt and his own bride and his own triplets. He placed his hand softly on Adiz's shoulder, and he spoke to her in a voice that was not loud but that carried across the whole of the village square because the village itself had gone so quiet. He told her that he forgave her. He told her that the Lord had taken care of the wound she had made in his chest, and that the Lord had also taken care of the wound she had made in her own chest. He told her that the fisherman who had come after her had not been her judgment, but only the river way of showing her that her heart had not yet learned the kind of love a woman owes a man who has paid 7 years of honest labor for her hand. He told her that her journey had been a long one, and that her endings did not have to be bitter. He told her that the triplets in the back of the black car were the children the village had mocked him for never having, and that the God who gave him those triplets was the same God who would never abandon Adiz if she lifted her heart back to the goddess with a clean prayer. He told her that the Christ of the Catechist had once loved a woman who had been caught in adultery, and that he had not stoned her. He had simply told her to go and sin no more. Share this story with one friend who needs it today, because the kneeling of Chaik beside Adiz in front of the whole village is the image I want every quiet man and every quiet woman to hold in their heart when the village has been unfair to them. The village did not applaud, the village did not cheer, the village did not gossip. The village simply stood in the silver-grey silence of Harmattan dust and watched two people, one kneeling and one kneeling beside her, forgive each other in front of the whole gathered community. Adiz lifted her head from the red earth. Her eyes were wet, but the wetness was not the kind of wetness that comes from shame. The wetness was the clean wetness of a woman who has been carrying a weight for 7 years, and has just set the weight down at the foot of the man she had wronged. She whispered softly that she would go with the river goddess that night, that she would stop fighting the river calling, that she would no longer wear the mask of human skin in the marriage of a man, and that she would spend the rest of her days as a daughter of the river shrine, helping other young women hear the river before the river took them by surprise. Chaik nodded his head. The elder chief under the Iroko tree lowered his chin in the slow nod of an elder who understands that a woman kneeling on red earth has just agreed to walk a path that not many have walked and returned from. Mama Ifoma stepped forward and brought Adiz a cup of cold water from the small clay pot the village kept by the throne for ceremonies, and Adiz drank the water, and the water was her first drink of plain water from another hand in 7 years. Tap that subscribe button before you leave, because the moral of the story is the moral every grandmother whispers at the foot of a grandchild bed at night. And the moral is the kind of moral that the village will still be telling at the fireside when the Harmattan comes again next year. The festival ended with the drummers playing a slow, soft beat the elders had reserved for moments of unusual reconciliation. The elders crowned the new chief of the river goddess, and the new chief was a young fisherman who had refused to take a second wife because his first wife had taught him that one good woman is worth more than 10 formal marriages. The traders from Abar and Onitsha and Port Harcourt and even Lagos stood around the throne and watched the festival end, and the talk among them was that the farmer who had been called cursed by his own village 7 years before had returned as a man of substance, and that the bride who had come back to him as a kneeling woman had been turned soft by the river she had been fighting. The jollof rice was served for the 3rd time that day. The pounded yam with egusi soup was served for the 2nd time that day. The pepper soup was served for the 4th time. The triplets were passed from hand to hand in the women corner of the square, and every woman who held one of them whispered a small prayer on their behalf. The black car Chaik had driven into the village was parked at the gate of the compound all day, and the children of the village gathered around it to touch the mirrors and the windows until their mothers called them back to the pounded yam and the egusi soup. The day went down slowly. The sun lowered behind the Iroko tree with the kind of gold the Harmattan only gives to the days it has chosen to favor. Stay with me, because the moral of this festival is the moral every quiet heart in the village will carry home that night. The moral of the story, my dear ones, is this: do not mock the man the village has cast out, because the God who allowed him to be cast out is the same God who will lift him up. The moral is also this: do not love the surface of a woman before you have looked at the depth of her, because some depths are waters that swallow the man who jumps in without prayer. The moral is also this: a man who works for 7 years without complaining and a woman who prays for years without complaining will both be met at the right season by the God who what? Ches the road. The moral is also this: forgiveness is not a small thing. Forgiveness is a kind of courage only a man who has been shaped by suffering can carry in his hands. The moral is also this: every curse the village places on a quiet man is a preparation for the miracle the God is keeping in his pocket for the day the man finally arrives at the right house. The moral is also this: some brides are sent by rivers. Some miracles are sent by a different God. The 2 rivers meet at the foot of a small Akara stand in Lagos, and the God who meets them there is the God who sees the heart before the village sees the wrapper. The Lord saw me before the village did, and the Lord has remembered me after the village forgot. That is the prayer a quiet man carries in his pocket when the harvest fails. That is the prayer a quiet woman carries in her wrapper when the marriage tests her. That is the prayer a child of the river carries in his breath when the river goddess finally calls him home. Drop a comment underneath telling me which line of the story you want to screenshot and send to a friend tonight, because the lines we capture at night are the lines that keep us warm in the morning. The river of forgiveness runs deeper than the river of the bride who shed her skin, and the only bridge across that river is the bridge a man builds with his 2 knees on the red earth of the village square, and the only toll the bridge demands is the courage to kneel. This is the story of one wedding night, and one river bride, and one roadside miracle, and one festival of forgiveness. This is the story of a man who did not raise his voice. This is the story of a woman who knelt on red earth. This is the story of a village that learned the hard way that the God they had mocked at the Akara stand had been standing at the Akara stand all along.